Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Wednesday, 28th of March 2018, and I'm here at the Miston Springs Protection Camp. And this morning I'm actually blessed with a studio audience, so thank you very much for getting up early. Big round of applause there. You didn't hear? Anyway, the title of this morning's broadcast is "For Frack's Sake, Is Nothing Sacred?" And this is actually a reference to what's occurring in Northern Territory in Australia right now. Because in Northern Territory, there's been a public inquiry into whether or not the unconventional gas industry should descend upon Northern Territory and destroy it in the same way as it has in southern Queensland. Well, just to put a few things in perspective, because for those of us in the UK, it can be a little bit difficult to comprehend the scale of Australia. Northern Territory, and I think most people will have probably heard of Darwin, which is the capital of the territory. But beyond Darwin, nobody could probably name a single other town. And there's actually fairly good reason for that, because there aren't too many. Anyway, Northern Territory is has an area of 1.42 million square kilometres. So that's 6 times the size of the UK. That's just Northern Territory, 6 times the size of the UK, and it has a total population of 250,000. So, you know, that's a population, what's that, about, I don't know, about the size of Ipswich, in an area that is 6 times the size of the UK. And the government of Northern Territory put a moratorium in place on fracking back in September of 2016. But Justice Rachel Pepper, who has been presiding over that inquiry, has now ruled that the risks associated with gas extraction can be managed. Where have we heard this before? Oh, just about everywhere. And, you know, I'm actually surprised that Kevin Hollinsnake of North Yorkshire wasn't invited out to go give evidence and share his experience of gas extraction in Pennsylvania. Anyway, she's made 134 recommendations, which she's described as a package deal that the government should implement in full if it decides to lift the moratorium. And you know, she's also made the recommendation that the Aborigine communities actually be consulted, which of course has been the case elsewhere. But consulting says, by the way, guys, we're going to frack here on your sacred lands, as has occurred in Queensland. Because this is an industry that doesn't give a flying frack about anything, not least the sacred lands of the original community of Australia. So this is Northern Territory looking to basically destroy the ecology of a massive tract of Australia, in the same way that a British company, British Gas, trading as QGC, the Queensland Gas Company, has destroyed a massive tract of land in southern Queensland. Of course, QGC is now owned by Shell. So the destruction now is being perpetrated by Shell, and of course Shell have a horrendous track record of riding roughshod over communities. I mean, look no further than the way in which they've treated communities in the Niger Delta. So, you know, Western Australia is also looking at the possibility of lifting its current informal moratorium, and Western Australia is even bigger. Western Australia is 2.6 million square kilometres. That's 11 times the size of the UK, with a population of 2.5 million. So an area 11 times the size of the UK, with a population that's no larger than, well, a small city. That's less people than live in Manchester. And of course, this is the territory of Gina Rinehart, the mining magnate daughter of Lang Hancock, who famously said some 40 odd years ago that those abos that haven't adapted to our way of life, in other words, they're not economic slaves, should be sterilised. And of course, we've seen that repeated more recently here in the UK, where it's been suggested that those people who don't want to get a job just get sterilised. you know, this is the mentality that we're dealing with. This is the mentality of the corporatists. Well, the Chief Minister of Northern Territory, Michael Gunner, said that once the final report has been carefully considered, the government would either ban fracking or allow it in highly regulated circumstances in tightly prescribed areas. In other words, really what he's saying is, you know, if the gas companies offer the appropriate bribes, then, you know, we probably won't be able to maintain the current moratorium. But he goes on to say, we will not put at risk existing fishing, farming, tourism or cattle jobs for the possibility of jobs from fracking. And at least he's acknowledged the possibility of jobs from fracking. And, you know, what is so amazing is that, you know, these people in the other territories, the government officials in the other territories, like Northern Territory, aren't taking a look at what has happened in Queensland, where, you know, there are now ghost towns, literally, that were booming just 6-7 years ago. And a classic example of this is Miles in Queensland, which is a few miles outside Chinchilla. And this town has literally become a ghost town. And what's happened is that it was a small community prior to 2010, 2011. And then the gas industry rolled into town. And because there weren't too many properties there, it pushed the rents up to over $1,000, 1,000 Australian dollars, about £600 or so, $1,000 a week. And this, of course, forced out the existing residents of the community because they could no longer afford the rents. So they went and moved elsewhere and actually discovered that there was life outside Miles, and actually have no intention of ever going back in most cases. And so what happened is the business owners in Miles thought, oh, this is an amazing opportunity. So they borrowed outrageous sums of money to expand their restaurants or expand their boarding houses. And then within 3 years, it was all over. And the gas companies were moving their employees out of town, leaving these business owners with massive debts and basically no choice except to walk away. So, you know, this town went from literally just an ongoing community to a boom town to totally bust and now almost devoid of any residents at all in the space of less than 4 years. So, you know, that's not likely to happen so much in the UK because of the, you know, the population density. But this is likely to be the case in Northern Territory. And, you know, Australia should, in theory, be one of the wealthiest countries on the planet because it, you know, it has a population of barely 25 million. And yet, you know, the size of Australia, it's 30 times the area of the UK. Just let that sink in. 30 times the size of the UK with a population of a little over a third, sorry, a little under a third of that of the UK. So with all of its mineral wealth, natural mineral wealth, and the fact that it's become the world's mine for particularly rare earth materials, but it should be the wealthiest nation in the world, and the people, you know, there should be enjoying, you know, extremely pleasant and you know, materialistic lifestyles, but they're not. In fact, the Australian people are amongst the most indebted on the planet, and that's because they've been suckered into borrowing against the wealth of the country, but of course they've been put in massive debt, so they are now good economic slaves who have no choice but effectively to serve the corporatocracy because of the magnitude of their debt. And Australia itself is currently sitting on a debt that's 45% of its gross domestic product. By the way, that's a lot better than here in the UK, where thanks to the Tory administration of the last 8 years, if we thought things were bad under the Labour government after the global financial collapse, when the Tories came to power, basically the debt in the UK was just under 1 trillion. And in the space of 8 years, the Tories have increased the level of national debt to 1.8 trillion, which is about about 102% of gross domestic product. And you know, for those who have seen my presentations from 2009, 10 and 11, where I made the observation that once the national debt exceeds 100% of gross domestic product, then you're pretty much on the road of no return. And it's the banksters that then come in and effectively clean up. You know, they're playing a game of global monopoly. And this is certainly what they're doing in Australia. They are looking to take ownership of absolutely everything. So, you know, one hopes that the people of Northern Territory, somewhat sparse that they are, but they will get behind their government and push for the ban. Because although, you know, the fracking of the coal seam gas may be going on a long way from where they reside, then, you know, there's a distinct possibility that it will migrate towards their backyard. So my thanks to Helen Bender for sending me some of this information. Of course, Helen is you know, very much a, dare I say, I use the term carefully, you know, a victim of the coal seam gas industry. Her father, George Bender, sadly took his own life some 2.5 years ago now, having fought this industry for best part of a decade. And eventually it just wore him down, ground him down, and you know, without any warning, just decided that enough was enough. And you know, we're going to see this around Australia, and if it kicks off here in the UK, I'm sure at some point, you know, we will see it here in the UK as people realise that they've been literally led a merry dance by an industry that promised the earth, and basically that's exactly what they took, the earth. So all I can ask is that people do their own research, and I have a conference call tonight with some people in Western Australia who are very keen to develop their own anti-fracking campaign. And you know, it has to be said that obviously building community groups in areas like Western Australia and Northern Territory with such a sparse population is certainly not going to be easy, and particularly in Western Australia, where so many of the population are dependent upon extraction industries for their income and you know, their livelihoods. So it's not an easy process, but you know, one way or another, people who are waking up to this obscenity all around the planet need to find ways in which they can offer mutual support and encouragement. But ultimately, it's an issue that can only be resolved at a local level, and putting massive pressure on local politicians and then building from the ground up. So I'm changing subject for a second. Over the last week or so, I've been talking about the link between 5G and the tree culling in Sheffield. And there's been a very interesting reaction, because some people in Sheffield have literally gone, no, I can't deal with it. I don't want to see it. You know, it's just too much for me. And of course, this is what the establishment and the corporatocracy rely upon. They rely upon situations where, when people cannot embrace the magnitude of the threat and the deception, they literally bury their heads in the sand. So look, you know, obviously there are people in Sheffield that are now very much on the case, and in other cities and towns around the UK where a tree felling program is being advanced. And you know, the fact that you don't want to make the link between 5G, and you know, I haven't even really addressed the relationship between Amy and Telefonica, and Amy's relationship with the development of driverless vehicles. You know, it's not a one-dimensional issue. So please, you know, don't bury your head in the sand. Keep doing what you're doing in terms of, you know, challenging the Sheffield Council agenda to destroy those trees, but bring yourself in gently. You know, I appreciate that for many people this is something that is so far beyond their bounds of comprehension, and they certainly can't bring themselves to believe that their local council, their Labour council, would sacrifice the trees of Sheffield in return for 5G. But sadly, that being the case, then you know, you're not aware of the power of this and the magnitude of corruption that occurs. Follow the money. It's a very, very important issue, and you know, burying your head in the sand isn't going to solve it. So, you know, stay with it. But as more and more people realise that this agenda to destroy the trees of the UK is driven by the desire to implement a telephone network, a telecoms network that literally enables the total control through the Internet of Things. And if you haven't come across the phrase Internet of Things, please do your own research. Okay, well, that's it from me today. I should be back tomorrow, and meanwhile, enjoy your day. Hopefully this early spring day will brighten up and get a little warmer, but I'll be back tomorrow at 8:30. You have a great day.
Starting to grow a fan base again.
Huh?
Starting to grow a fan base, look.
Oh, yeah. No, they're just waiting to shit on me. Oh, I'm still screaming.